it does seem like if Israel were all out attacked by Iran, the United States would come to its defense. No, is that not like sort of presumed? And if that's true, then why not wait till you're actually under threat instead of provoking countries across the region to preemptively destroy rising powers before they can threaten you? I mean,
Well, no, actually, it does make more sense for you to do so before they're powerful enough to be able to really damage you. But also, the Israelis know that time is not on their side. Technology has already evened the playing field in the last 10, 15 years. Take a look at how drones were used in the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah compared to what they have been just in the last 5 years or so. We're in a completely different picture. Now also you have the Iranians having very advanced ballistic missiles. Even the Houthis have ballistic missiles that can hit Israel now. This is very different. You extrapolate this for another 10 years, there's a decent likelihood that the technology will further even the playing field, further reduce Israel's strategic edge. And under those circumstances, even if the United States comes in and aids Israel, restores that balance by taking on some of these parties and countries, nevertheless, it would end up being very, very costly for the Israelis because they will take a lot of hits, a tremendous amount of damage. If you can compel the United States or lure the United States into that war at a much earlier stage, then first of all, you will take far less damage. It will be easier and less costly for the Israelis to do so, for the Americans to do so, which then also creates a situation in which it will be more likely seen as a success, which then means that you may be able to get the US to do so once again in 10 or 15 years. But if it's very costly, both to you and to the United States, then it might just be a one-off, and you will never be able to get the United States to be so foolish to get dragged into such a thing again.
isn't the whole point though of the Iran nuclear deal to limit the development of the kinds of weapons that would be threatening to Israel? Why are you thwarting a deal that ostensibly does an important technological way neuter your opponent and your enemy in quotation marks ability to threaten you?
So
Again,
this
you're
is
just
what was
saying, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
This is what's so perplexing for the Obama administration, because they essentially went ahead. The Israelis said that Iran's nuclear program was an existential threat. The Obama administration neutralized the existential threat through a deal that really contained it and expected a thank you. Instead, they got more vitriol than any other president has gotten from an Israeli prime minister, because at the end of the day, it wasn't about the nuclear program. It was about the balance in the region. And the threat to Israel was not merely a nuclear one from their standpoint. It was a balance in the region in which Iran would be allowed to continue to grow and become more powerful, which it could be because the United States lifted many of the sanctions against Iran. The sanctions were there to be kept, to keep Iran down and not allow it to grow and shift the balance against the Israelis. If the Iranians had nuclear weapons, it obviously would not be a good thing for the Israelis. But between an Iran that moved towards a nuclear weapon and an Iran that didn't have nuclear weapons but could grow conventionally, become rehabilitated internationally, politically, the Israelis
Mm.
prefer to have an Iran that continued to have a nuclear program, because if it continued to have a nuclear program, it would continue to be at odds with the United States, and you could still get another bite at the apple of getting the United States to go to war with Iran.
Okay, all right, all of that makes sense. Why does Iran seem to
Well, it
be
makes sense from that standpoint if one holds the view that there is no chance that Israel actually can have real peace with its neighborhood. It can only dominate, which I completely disagree with. And this is the fundamental original question and answer that pushes Israel in a completely wrong direction. There's no country that in the long term has been able to live securely simply by dominating its neighborhood militarily. You have to manage threats and you have to be able to coexist. If you can't do that, ultimately you're undermining your own security.
I mean, my question was going to be, why is it that there's this discussion of being able to basically buy off these other states in the region and have normalization with Saudi Arabia, which is also extremely affluent and powerful and has all of these arms and all of these other kinds of things. But Iran, uniquely, it seems the strategy is to neuter it through sanctions, um, try to suppress it through conventional warfare by provoking a conventional war. And that it just seems different from Saudi Arabia, for example, that the possibility of normalization is just completely off the table. Why is Iran being singled out in this way?
Well, I wouldn't say that Iran necessarily is being singled out. First of all, in terms of the Saudis and others, we're not talking about countries that have the same potential as Iran. Um, it has a population that dwarfs that of Saudi Arabia, completely dwarfs that of all of the GCC
What is
states.
the population of Iran?
Iran is at about 86, 87 million. So has a territory that is obviously very large. It has gas, it has oil, it has all of these different things. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia has a tremendous amount of
36 million in Saudi Arabia. It's not tiny.
It's certainly not tiny in any way, shape, or form, but Iran is almost three times its size in terms of population. The Saudis, of course, have a tremendous amount of wealth. But when you take a look at least where they have been up until just recently, their scientific base is incomparable. Iran and Israel completely tops the region in terms of that. So their ability, their potential to be able to pose that type of a threat to Israel is completely different. If you then take, Morocco and other countries, UAE, then, obviously there's no question. And Morocco is too far away anyways. So that, first of all, puts it in a very different direction. Secondly, all of the different countries that were part of the Abraham Accord were already countries that were part of the American circle, very much dependent on the United States, or wanting to have a much stronger relationship with the United States. That's not Iran. Iran is not seeking to be a proxy of the United States. That's what part of the revolution was about. Now, whether the current population agrees with that or not is a different story. And I would say that even though the vast majority of Iranians would like to have a decent and a good relationship with the United States, want to be friends with the United States, I don't think anyone there is seriously looking to go back to an era in which Iran is dependent on the United States, or Iran has to act in a way in the region in which it constantly needs to ask for permission from the US, or constantly be aligned with the United States. The Iranian self-perception is that it is a state that has been the dominant power for most of its history, that it has a natural right to be a regional leader. And as a result, it doesn't like the idea of having to adjust itself constantly to a superpower 2 worlds away. But on top of that, you also have to keep in mind that the effort with these Abraham Accords was really to further make these countries more dependent on the United States. And that's the leverage that would exist to ensure that these countries would, keep mum when Israel is killing Palestinians. And take a look at where the UAE is or Morocco is today on this issue, and where they probably would have been if this war was taking place 20 years ago. The Moroccans, for instance, just allowed Israeli warships to port in Moroccan ports after the Spanish had refused to allow them to port there as a protest against what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. But Morocco allowed it. And Morocco allowed it because, as part of the Abraham Accords, it's even more tied to the United States. And as a result, it has to take even more Israeli concerns into consideration when it makes decisions.
Okay, I've taken us pretty far afield from kind of immediate contemporary events. So I want to direct us back to the killing of Haniyeh in Tehran and the escalations that have happened since then. America has sent a couple of warships now, aircraft carriers to the region. You described, I think, on another program, I heard you call it Iran as a strategy of kind of strategic non-response, but I forget the terminology that you used, of not taking the bait, basically. Yeah.
Earlier on, they had a strategy that they called strategic patience. They were taking a lot of hits from the Israelis in Syria and elsewhere, not on their own territory. And they, absorbed those because they were playing the long game. This was not a strategy that necessarily was very popular. There were elements in the government that clearly disagreed with it. They believed that because Iran had not pushed back, the Israelis just kept on pushing the envelope. Once the Israelis understood Iran was playing a strategic game of patience, then, that's a green light. Just keep on going forward. And then the Israelis hit the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And that was like the final straw that broke the camel's back. The Iranians shifted away from strategic patience, responded to Israel, but did so in a manner that was very, very carefully choreographed to show their force, show their deterrence capabilities, but avoid escalation in a full-scale war. There, I think the Biden administration actually, behind the scenes, played a constructive role and actually did put some pressure on Israel, which showed that they absolutely could put pressure on Israel if they wanted to. They had just chosen not to do so earlier. But there was still, as I wrote in the New York Times at the time, that was a tactical success within a larger American strategic failure, because we should not even be in this position in which we're that close to a regional war. If the United States had pushed for a ceasefire much earlier on, there would never have been this exchange of fire between Iran and Israel in the first place. And now, 4 months later, we're clearly seeing that it was just a tactical success within a larger strategic failure, because the Israelis then went even further. Instead of striking an Iranian consulate in a third country, they struck inside of Tehran itself on the day of Iran's presidential inauguration. So the strategic patience was abandoned in April. And because of that, the Iranians have kind of put themselves in a corner. They cannot go back to that. After Israel has done this, they have to respond one way or another. The challenge they have is they want to restore deterrence. They do not want a war. Israel seems to want to have a war, at least Netanyahu does, for certain. And as a result, how do you respond in order to restore deterrence, but avoid providing the Israelis with the opportunity and the pretext to escalate further? All of this would be so much easier if Biden actually had a history of using his leverage to restrain Israel. But because he hasn't, the Iranian calculation becomes far more dangerous, because now they only have themselves to rely on to restore deterrence, because they can't count on the United States doing anything to restrain Israel, even if the United States says that it doesn't want to have a larger regional war.
Yeah. So what do you think is going to happen?
I think right now there's elements in Iran that clearly want an off ramp. And if there can be a ceasefire, then they will take some credit for it. They will deserve some credit for it. And then they may do something much smaller and say that's it. They managed to achieve a ceasefire. In fact, the senior official in a regional country just 2 days ago told me that Iran has created an opportunity for a ceasefire because it is the threat of Iranian retaliation that has put fire under the feet of the Biden administration to try to do something. The question is if that do something is just a movement of diplomacy or if it actually has the substance of it. So far, in the absence of the Biden administration actually using its leverage, it seems to me that it's just the movement, not the substance. That can help in the short term. It will not help in the long term.
So basically you're saying Iran is sort of tethered it knows it's on its own. It can't expect any sort of rational non-escalation from Israel, and also that America is not going to put pressure on Israel to do so. It's kind of tethered its willingness not to escalate now that it's kind of abandoned its strategic patience to the fate of Palestinians. And so then there's an opportunity to say, oh, maybe you don't care about Gaza, but we do care about not wanting to go with a war with Iran. Okay, America, let's get in line and have a ceasefire to stop Iran from escalating, which its hand is being forced to sort of do. All of
two
that.
weeks.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Go
go ahead.
ahead.
2 weeks after October 7th, I wrote a piece in which I said if Biden doesn't care about the plight of the Palestinians, at a minimum, he should care about the fact that the American people don't want to go into another war in the region. Yeah. And unless you get a ceasefire, this is going to cause escalation in the region, eventually drag the United States into it. I may have been wrong in the sense that I thought that this escalation would have come much earlier, but I think I was quite right in terms of pointing out already back then that the only way to truly avoid that escalation is to have a ceasefire. And it's a huge mistake by the administration not to center U.S. interest here. And that interest is to avoid that escalation, avoid getting dragged into that war, and as a result, use that as the reason to impose a ceasefire. It doesn't have to be, we don't need to have a president that, is empathetic to the Palestinians. We just need one that actually follows U.S. interests, and U.S. interest is to avoid that war, which then necessitates a ceasefire.
I confess, Trita, that things have gotten things are so, the scale of destruction is so incredible at this point that I do wonder what the day after looks like, even in the best case scenario. I
It's devastating. Yeah.
the pressure has been okay. We need a ceasefire. We need to save lives. We need to, and then every day you're watching. First, it was this historic church and this historic landmark, and okay, now these graves are being dug up, and like okay, now every hospital and every school, and you're just looking at the before and after photos, and people marching back and forth through rubble, and quite obviously the human cost, which is dramatically undervalued. Um, and I do wonder if like it's almost required to shift the goalpost because the point at which like the maximum value of simply stopping a bombardment was before you killed upward of Lancet estimating 180,000 people and completely devastated an entire area. Like just created conditions, which is what some members of the Israeli cabinet said they wanted to do, which is to make it impossible for Palestinians to want to stay there, to want to return there, to be able to shuffle them off into some new area and to settle Gaza. And so now there's a part of me that if it really does feel like an acquiescing to, it's like you beat me up and stole my lunch money, and then like we're gonna settle on, okay, I guess I agree that you can take my lunch money. Like, what if you're gonna stop beating me up? You've already gotten everything that you've wanted, basically. Do you know what I mean? And I do wonder if you've given any thought to what a resolution of this looks like that creates some accountability for what it's meant for our government and Israel's government to have intentionally prolong this process in a way that's caused an absolutely irreversible and horrific loss of life and destruction of an entire community.
Look, you point to something extremely important, and that is that all of the talk about a ceasefire may have left people with the impression that that is the end state. That is absolutely not the end state. But a ceasefire is absolutely necessary in order to be able to move on to some of these other things. And we do need a real solution to this conflict in order to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Once we have a real solution, we also need to have accountability for why this happened in the first place. Accountability in Israel, accountability in the United States for those who have been pushing for a policy that in reality was aiding a genocide. Accountability in Europe for all of the support that they have provided Israel during this time as well. This is particularly true for Germany, which is the second largest arms supplier to Israel. Today, their foreign ministry condemns something Israel had done, which is completely meaningless, while they're still providing all the weapons for them to do all of the things that Germany then condemns. But I think a ceasefire is nevertheless absolutely the first necessary step. We're not going to be able to get to those other things if the slaughter is continuing simultaneously. I think there's some other things that have happened here that I think are important. We now have an ICJ ruling. There's no longer a debate as to whether this is occupied, whether Gaza is occupied or not, whether there is apartheid taking place. We have, legal findings there from the highest court in the world. This also then means that the formula that the United States has been using for the last 30, 40 years, which is that everything has to be settled in a direct negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, that has to be abandoned. This is not about a negotiation. This is about the fact that international law has been violated and international law needs to be restored and respected. That means that there has to be a Palestinian state. It has to be at least based on the 1967 borders, and there can be some adjustments to it that both sides agreed to. But you don't have this process in which you have one of the mightiest countries in the world negotiating with a people that don't even have a state and then expect that to miraculously lead to some sort of a equitable, just, and sustainable solution. That's been one of the core flaws of the American approach from the outset. There has to actually be, in my view, a solution imposed because the Palestinians are not in a strong position enough to be able to negotiate from under the rubble what they actually are entitled to according to international law. Moreover, I think it's absolutely crucial to end all of the processes in which the United States is in the lead of. We do not have any credibility left in the region for this. And our track record of leading these negotiations has led us to this position. And not just the October 7th and all of the horrors that have happened, but to the fact that the Trump administration completely dished the Palestinian issue, went for a normalization without a Palestinian state, and then Biden came in and he continued that. He continued that because he tried to outdo Trump by getting Saudi Arabia to normalize without anything for the Palestinians. And it's only an afterthought after October 7th on which they've beefed up a little bit of the language of what the Palestinians would get. And it's still nothing. It's just, some stronger verbs or language, but nothing in substance. So it's not a Trump thing. This is what Biden did as well. In fact, he tried to outdo it. Look at the press releases that came out of the Biden administration when when this rocket, whatever it was, whether it was Hezbollah, whether it was a malfunctioning Iron Dome that hit that soccer field in occupied Golan, the United States, the Biden administration called it Northern Israel. It recognized exactly what the Trump administration had done, which was recognize Israel's illegal annexation of that part of Syria. So you have a situation in which the United States claims to support a two-state solution, claims to be leading a process for a two-state solution, whereas in reality, it has set the stage for no state for the Palestinians whatsoever and a complete acquiescence of the rest of the region. It's going to fail, and it's going to cost the United States a tremendous amount of credibility. It already has. But any future process cannot be led by the United States because we've seen the track record of that, not just for the Palestinians, but also for the United States itself.
Is it going to fail? Is it going to fail, Trita? Because it's like, okay, we have the ICJ decisions, but our country has demonstrated a willingness to selectively ignore and apply international law. It feels like if anything was resolved in this conflict, it's the complete and total irrelevance of it in terms of if creating accountability for Western countries. It is what do they call it? The International Caucasian Court. It is law for the global South and not for Europe and the United States of America. You have, what does it, practically speaking, okay, the United States isn't going to administer, it doesn't have the credibility to it, administer any kind of resolution in the region. Who does? Who would America allow to usurp its authority to make sure whatever happens is in its best interest? Realistically speaking, yeah.
You use the word allow again, and I think we're moving towards a world that is not going to be the unipolar world of the mid-1990s, in which I think that term allow would have been much more realistic to use. I think we're moving already rather fast into a world in which the United States no longer will be able to call all the shots. It's going to eventually force us to be more collaborative, I think, than we are right now, because it will lie in our own interest to do so. Whereas as long as we think that we can just, make all decisions on our own and impose it on others, that's what we unfortunately have tended to do. But I think already we're seeing how many of these institutions, and you're quite right, they were not designed to hold Western countries accountable, but they now are. And you're seeing global South countries taking the lead on this. I'm not saying that the United States is not going to remain the most powerful country in the world, but the type of maneuverability it had to be able to impose the most unfair kind of outcomes or sustain a very unfair situation, I don't think it simply will have. And take that on the external front, and then on the internal front, I think we're seeing dramatic changes in the American populace and its attitude towards Israel-Palestine, towards foreign military interventions. It's going to take some time for that to translate into political realities. I think to a certain extent it already has. It's quite interesting. For the last couple of presidencies, they all claim that they don't want to have any more wars. They're all using the language of avoiding forever wars, etc. Has it led us to the type of a foreign policy that we at the Quincy Institute would be happy with? Not at all. But has it at times moved in the right direction? Are those restrictions preventing decision makers from making even worse decisions? Yes. I think we can see some clear influence there. I think it's going to be much more and accelerated because of Gaza. So I'm optimistic when it comes to where we may end up being in 5 to 10 years. I think it's going to be a very, very rough journey until we get to that point. But I cannot see that after this episode, the United States is going to be able to go back to the old posture that it had for politicians to still think like Biden did, that we're living in that old world in which the politically safe position is to always be as pro-Israel as possible, regardless of whether that is actually even good for Israel or not. I mean, we're sitting in a situation in which you have members of Congress who are fundraising off of opposing AIPAC, including Republicans. 20 years ago, that was an impossibility. Does it dramatically change picture right now? No, but I think it's pointing a trend, a direction that will eventually dramatically change the political realities around this issue in the United States. And when it comes to the US's power globally, that train has already left the station. We are moving away from unipolarity. We have already left this unipolarity. The question is what type of a multipolar or bipolar world we will be in. But we will not be in a type of a world any longer, I think, in which the United States is in a position to allow or disallow these things. Take a look what the Chinese did between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The US wasn't even aware of those negotiations, but they normalized those relations. They didn't ask for permission from the US. And they are hosting the Palestinian factions. So, we're seeing that things are happening without the United States. Countries are not asking for permission to do so. 20 years ago, South Africa would never have filed those complaints at the ICJ without getting some sort of a nod of approval from the United States. These days they do. And look at the number of countries that signed on to it as well. So I do think that there are clear trends that are pointing us in a direction of change. Is it fast enough? No. Is it going to save the people of Gaza tomorrow? Unfortunately not.
Or 5 year or ever. Like I'm just imagining this world where Kamala Harris is president. Technically, there's a ceasefire. You have 2 million fewer, once we get the real death tolls in, many, many fewer people in Gaza without any buildings left standing. And our humanitarian, warm-hearted, tonally shifted commander-in-chief says, well, look, regrettably, through no fault of our own, there's nowhere for them to live in Gaza. So we are going to graciously invite everybody from Gaza to go live somewhere else. And they're going to be caravanning them into there was some desert area that, and like it is greater in Israel that they were going to be ferried into based on one of those leaked plans early on in all of this. Or Egypt's going to take this many and whomever, we're going to ferry them across the Arab world. And lo and behold, they're never going to come back, and we're going to get beachfront property the way so many settlers have been salivating over up and down the Gaza coast. Israeli beachfront properties. I mean, it's hard not to predict exactly that.
I mean, you're pointing towards an extremely negative scenario. I find it unlikely, I have to say.
What do you think is going to happen? I mean,
not because of any particular belief in the goodness of any particular politician that will come in after Biden. It has nothing to do with that. I think just the power realities does not allow for a crime of that size to take place. If the Egyptians were going to cave to that pressure, they would have caved to it now in the midst of this genocide. I don't see them caving to it after a ceasefire.
But I think there's like a quote unquote humanitarian argument that once you've made it so that there's no place for people to go where they once lived, then yeah, sure. Yeah. Like now that it's over, the best case scenario for any given human being and any given family is to be able to take shelter where there's real shelter and clean water and not cholera and polio and everything else. And there's a humanitarian case to be made for why a Gazan should go somewhere else that you can't make unless and until you've destroyed all of Gaza, which they've done. And so Egypt not wanting to acquiesce to that 8 months ago is a little different than 8 months from now, maybe. You don't think?
You're scaring me, first of all, because I would also be very upset if that scenario were to happen. But I have to say, I do still find it unlikely because there is such an awareness based on what has happened in the past that if the territory is abandoned, even if so temporarily, a certain legal claim will be lost politically, not legally, however. And as a result, if there is a ceasefire, I can see a scenario far more likely that there will be significant efforts to make sure that there is aid provided to them inside the territory rather than outside. Also, I have to remind, the Gazans are not going to leave happily or voluntarily. You would actually really have to force them to leave.
Yeah.
Having survived this, they're not going to then suddenly say, okay, and now we'll leave. So I don't find those scenarios very unlikely. What I think is very valid in what you're pointing out is that there will still be elements who will think, let's just do the absolute minimum because that's what's costing us the least politically. And as a result, just try to kick the can down the road and then by that, create a scenario in which the urgency of these matters are gone, which then again allows the Israelis to do this inching and annexation. I do hope that there will be, and I am somewhat optimistic that there will be so much political momentum for finally resolving this issue, having recognized that part of the reason, a significant part of the reason why this happened in the first place was precisely because we ignored the Palestinian issue. We felt that the status quo, even though it wasn't ideal in any way, shape, or form, it simply wasn't costly enough for us to bother to do anything about it. But now it actually has become costly enough, way more costly than we expected. And as a result, the political will that is needed to be mustered to do something about it can be mustered.
Yeah. Well, look, I appreciate you spending the time here as always. It's edifying, even if I'm a little demoralized. Can I ask just really quickly, though, before we go, what you make of Donald Trump meeting with Netanyahu and reportedly telling him, Trump says he said, quote, get your victory quickly because, quote, the killing has to stop.
It's been reported that you recently spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu, maybe as recently as yesterday. Can you clarify when the last time was you talked to him and what advice, if any, you're giving him about a ceasefire, about ending this war?
The last time I saw him was at Mar-a-Lago, and he came with his wife and a large group of people. And we had a very good relationship with him and with Israel. Again, this would never have happened. October 7th would have never happened, would have never, ever happened. And he asked for the meeting. We had the meeting. It was about 2 hours, 2.5 hours long. And I expect I might be talking to him, but I haven't since then. No.
Did you encourage him not to take a ceasefire deal? Did you give him any advice about ending the war?
No, he knows what he's doing. I did encourage him to get this over with. You want to get it over with. It has to get over with fast. But have victory, get your victory, and get it over with. It has to stop. The killing has to stop. Yes, please.
Mr. President.
Thank you, President.
Do you have any thoughts about what that is all about, sort of strategically? It's obviously getting interpreted by the anti-war right as, yeah, Trump is going to solve this more quickly. What do you make of it?
Well, first of all, I would take anything Trump says carefully in the sense that we want you to necessarily believe that he actually said it. However, I don't see any political benefit from him, from his standpoint, to lie about this. You know, he's been saying so many things that are so blatantly beyond the pale when it comes to just siding with Israel blindly. So to say something like this publicly, but actually not having said it privately, I find it less likely. I actually think that there's a decent likelihood that he did say it. And I wouldn't be surprised that he did say it for a very simple reason. If I was Trump and I thought that there may end up being a ceasefire at some point, I would want to have on the record that I said something like this to Netanyahu so that I can take credit for it, even if I had nothing to do with it.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.